Welcome to lecture number 6, our final lecture, entitled Restoring the Constitution, Taking Effective Action. All the education that we've gone through in the last 5 lectures really comes down to now, what are we going to do with it? Is it just to be more knowledgeable, or is it to actually help restore the Constitution? Where I want to begin today, a brief rehearsal again of the state of our nation. I think we've clearly shown that we're not using the Constitution anymore. And if we were, it would solve the majority of the problems our nation is facing today. I'll use just one example we've used previously, one of my favorites, Congressman Pete Stark of California, who, surprisingly, very openly admitted his view that in this country, the federal government can do pretty much whatever it wants to. We don't have limited government anymore. Today, the federal government really does whatever they want to, whatever they feel they can get away with. So, again, a brief review. We talked about the dangers of democracy, the enumerated powers, and how important it is that we understand what was actually authorized by the Constitution and what is not. We understand the dangers of the Federal Reserve System, which was never authorized by the Constitution and gives tremendous power to private hands. And we understand the limits on our war powers on the federal level and the neoconservative movement with their attempt to misuse war powers against us and against other nations. And then in the last lecture, we went into the enemies of freedom. It's essential we understand those who are intentionally working to overthrow liberty from both political parties, as well as their representation in the schools, both public schools and colleges, media, and the money powers and how they control things as well. It's important to understand the enemy. So today, how do we restore the Constitution with all of this in mind? One possibility that has been put forward quite a bit lately is the plan of a constitutional convention. Now, this comes from Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, where it declares the method in which we can propose amendments, changes to the Constitution. If you want to turn with me there, in this edition of the Constitution, it's on page 27. And there it says, Article 5 begins, "The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution." I'll pause there for a moment. That's the first way out of 2. Congress, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, proposes an amendment. That's the only way we have ever amended the Constitution, by the way. But there's another way that's mentioned in here. It says, "Or, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states," then you could insert the Congress, "shall call a convention for proposing amendments." And then it goes on to the ratification process, which in either case would be part of the Constitution when ratified by 3/4 of the states. So this possibility of the state legislatures, 2/3 of the state legislatures, calling for a convention. What was their actual duty there, though? It wasn't to actually call the convention. It said it was on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states, then Congress shall call the convention. Now, there are many groups out there today, freedom-based organizations, that are advocating we need to propose new amendments to the Constitution to get us back on track. Now, on its face, I'd say there's a problem with that. That implies that the Constitution is the problem, not the solution. I would say it's not the Constitution that's the problem, it's ignoring the Constitution is the problem. And on its face, the idea of proposing an amendment to the Constitution they're ignoring, wouldn't they probably ignore that amendment as well? Well, perhaps. But here's some of the things they claim. First of all, they strictly declare that this is not a constitutional convention we're calling for, it's merely an amendments convention. Some of them get very particular about what wording we want to call it. Now, that implies that there's a big difference between a constitutional convention and an amendments convention. I want to describe that for you for a moment. Is there any definition somewhere in the Constitution, perhaps, of what can be and cannot be changed by an amendment? Because that's what they're implying here. A constitutional convention, such as what we had in 1787, they went in there with the instructions to amend the Articles of Confederation. What they did was they threw them out. They started with a clean slate. And those of us who are against proposing another convention today point to that as a danger. There was a precedent set. If we were to call a new convention today, couldn't they take the existing form of government and throw it out, just like they did in 1787? And that is a distinct possibility. Those that are advocating a constitutional convention, or as they call it, an amendments convention, claim that, oh no, this is not a constitutional convention. An amendments convention is much more limited. So my question is there any defined limit to the amendment process? The answer is yes, actually. If you look to the end of Article 5, here we are on page 28, up toward the top, you'll see that section that's italicized. It says, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses of the 9th section in the first article. That refers to slavery, just so you know. And that clearly had an expiration date of 1808. So those two sections there are prohibited against changing prior to 1808. Now we're free to do so, which was prohibiting the importation of slaves and things of that nature. But what remains, the last sentence here says that no state shall, without its consent, no state shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. So that's the only thing that we can no longer do as an amendment. We cannot deprive a state of its equal suffrage in the Senate without its consent. Now, one way of looking at that would be that, well, gee, with the 17th Amendment, didn't we do that? With the 17th Amendment, the states no longer have their suffrage, their vote, in the U.S. Senate, because the U.S. senators no longer answer to our states. They answer to the people. Did every state sign on to the 17th Amendment? Well, no, they didn't. So it could be reasoned that the one thing that we're told we cannot do by amendment, we did by amendment with the 17th. And other than that, either way, there's no other limit. There is no other difference between an amendments convention and a constitutional convention. So as long as that's not on the table, we can't deprive the states of their equal suffrage in the Senate. Are you comfortable with everything else in the Constitution could be repealed or changed? I'm not. So those that oppose a constitutional convention, or an amendments convention as they call it, like myself, I declare that there really is no significant difference between an amendments convention and a constitutional convention. That's an invalid argument, really. The next claim they make is that a convention really can be limited to just one topic. We could call for an amendments convention for a balanced budget amendment, and it would have to be limited to that one topic. But what's to constrain that convention once they're brought together? Well, now that we've worked out our amendment that we were sent here to do, while we're together, I propose that we also have another amendment. Is there anything to stop them from doing that? Well, no, there isn't. And they do admit that that is a possibility, even though they want to do everything they can to limit it to one topic. There's nothing in the Constitution that hints at a limit. In fact, what does it say? Let's go back up to the top of the page here. Actually, the bottom of page 27, first of all, once the 2/3 of the states have applied for a convention, it says that Congress shall call a convention for proposing amendments. The word is plural, amendments. Does that imply that we can limit it to one? Not really. That implies that they can call a convention for multiple amendments. And that's the only thing it says. So there is no basis for that claim. The next one, they do claim that even if a convention does exceed its call, now see, they do admit that it is possible, but the ratification process will protect us. We wouldn't ever pass a bad amendment through 3/4 of the states, would we? Well, let me think. I think the 16th Amendment would qualify. The 17th Amendment, I'd say, was also a bad amendment that the states did pass. So I'm not so sure that the ratification process is that great of a protection. But worse yet, look at the precedent that was set in 1787. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not in any way speaking ill of the great men that wrote the Constitution. It was vital that they did repeal the Articles of Confederation. They broke a number of rules in the process, and I felt they had to do so. But the ratification process that they were given was, whatever they come up with must be ratified by 13 out of 13 state legislatures, unanimous. Is that what they did? No, it's not. If you continue forward to the next page, on page 29, you see Article 7, they wrote a new process for ratification. They wrote their own rules. What it says there is, the ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution. I didn't see 13 states mentioned, did you? 9 states, they said. They changed the ratio. They reduced it to be easier to achieve. But another thing you didn't see in there was it never mentioned the state legislature. That was who was supposed to ratify. They said the ratification of the conventions of 9 states. The conventions were special ratifying conventions consisting of delegates who were not state legislators. They recognized the state legislators would see this new constitution as giving up state power. Who, in the position of power, wants to give up power? They knew that the forces would be working against them if the state legislators had to ratify. And so they changed who, and they changed how many it would take to ratify. Could that precedent perhaps be followed again today? Well, it certainly could, especially considering all of our attorneys in the country are typically trained in precedent, in case law. They don't look to the wording of the Constitution as much as they look to what previous cases have been ruled on the topic. What is the precedent set? And I fear that that precedent could allow a convention to write their own rules for ratification, and who knows what that may be. In addition to that, one other surprising admission of those that are promoting such a convention is that, of course, a convention is not without its risks, but it must be weighed against the very real danger of doing nothing. I didn't know those were the only 2 choices. Either we have to call a convention or do nothing in the face of this danger of our country going off course. I believe that we do have other choices. In fact, I will demonstrate that very clearly here. In the process, though, of proposing a convention, we really could risk losing the entire Constitution. So, what better solutions do we have? Well, first of all, anytime we're proposing any solution to a problem, we need to find out what is causing the problem. Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, back in 1970, demonstrated the dangers of ineffective action. He says, there has been plenty of energy, enthusiasm, and money expended by patriotic Americans to have stopped the enemy several times over. Most of it, however, has actually and cleverly been shunted off course or guided into support of the very things the enemy wanted to accomplish. During the time the John Birch Society has been around, we have seen thousands and thousands of freedom groups come and go with many different plans of how to restore the Constitution or whatever else. There has been plenty of energy expended in the cause. Unfortunately, most of it has been ineffective, largely because we don't first identify what's causing the problem. We need a proper diagnosis. If you were to go into the doctor, tell him you're not feeling well, and before you say another word, and without ever giving you a checkup, he simply says, you need this prescription, have a nice day. I don't think I would take that prescription. I'd be a little leery because he has no idea what's wrong with us. In the same way, we can't prescribe a solution to our nation's ailments unless we understand what is the root of the problem. So what is the root of the problem? Is any one of these people? Sometimes I have people acting as though Obama is the root of the problem, or Bush, or whoever. Well, clearly if it was George Bush, he's no longer in office, our problems are solved. If it was Obama, once his terms are over, problem solved. And that would also imply that we didn't have a problem before him. Clearly that's not true. These problems have existed for decades and decades. We just accounted over the last 100 years' history, actually, in lecture number 5, of serious problems infiltrating in our own government. The root of the problem is none of these. In fact, those of the ones on this page that we're electing to various offices are merely symptoms of the problem. I would point out, for example, that Nancy Pelosi is an excellent representative of her people. She represents their views. That's why she keeps getting elected. She is merely a symptom of the type of mentality of politics in her district, as is every congressman or senator. They represent those that are willing to support them and elect them. So the problem really isn't them, it's us. Those who are electing these people that are destroying our freedom. I think this is best illustrated by a man by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville. He came to America in the early 1800s to discover what was the secret of America's overnight, miraculous strength and success. what we often would refer to as the miracle of America. That in just a few decades, we became a world power economically, militarily. As he traveled around America, he discovered some very interesting things. He said that in America, the people are free to do all kinds of things that are illegal in Europe, and yet they don't do them. That we are self-restraining, that we don't need government to tell us what we can or cannot do. And he pointed to the cause of that was the role that religion played in all of our lives here in America. That religion, without having any formal ties to politics, guided the philosophy and the morals of our political structure. It was very interesting to him the way it played such a role. He also noted that principles of liberty and the Constitution were preached from the pulpit in the churches. Because of that, one quote here from him, he says that in America, every citizen is taught the history of his country and the leading features of its Constitution. Well, that sounds like today, doesn't it? Yeah. I wish. He goes on to say it's extremely rare to find a man imperfectly acquainted with all these things, and a person wholly ignorant of them is sort of a phenomenon. Virtually everyone you talk to is thoroughly versed on the Constitution. To find one man that isn't, it's a phenomenon. It's bizarre. Today, if I were to apply his statement to today, I'd have to reverse this. Today, it's extremely rare to find a man who's vaguely acquainted with the Constitution and our national history, and a person wholly educated on them is sort of a phenomenon. If that was the great strength of America in the early 1800s, that is the great weakness of our country today. Because of that, I declare that we will never restore liberty to this country until we first restore the principles of liberty to the hearts and minds of the people. That, in its simplest form, is the solution. We must restore those principles of liberty to the hearts and minds of the people, so again we establish the type of society that Tocqueville described. That is the solution. Now, with that understanding, I want to analyze a few proposals that various freedom groups have brought forward as here's how we can help restore liberty. Term limits, for example. Let's compare back and forth a society as Tocqueville described versus a society on the opposite end of the spectrum, one that's thoroughly indoctrinated in socialism. In a society that's thoroughly indoctrinated in socialism, which we're almost there, what would term limits do for us? They would simply guarantee our faster turnover of our socialist leaders. It wouldn't make any difference in the quality of leadership. They would all be socialists because that's what we would elect. In a society as Tocqueville described, term limits would take away the best from us. When you have a rare one like a Washington, a Jefferson, a Madison, or someone like that, they would be term limited out and we wouldn't be able to have them continue to serve us. We'd have to settle for the average, the mediocre. So in neither case do term limits help us. The next one, a balanced budget amendment. In a society dedicated to socialism, balanced budget amendments means higher taxes. It doesn't mean it's going to restrain the government in any way. It just means higher taxes. And if we were truly following the Constitution again today, we wouldn't need a balanced budget amendment because the unbalanced budget is already unconstitutional. We covered previously that it would trim the federal government by at least 80%. We would have a budget surplus. Completely unnecessary. The next one, any other amendment proposals? The real danger here is that the amendment proposals always end up saying, well, Congress will never pass this amendment, so we need to pursue an amendments convention. And that's a very dangerous place to begin. I don't dare open the Constitution for revision in today's political climate, nor is there any need to do so. What about getting the right candidate elected? Now, this is not a bad thing to be involved in, don't get me wrong. I highly encourage you to support the candidates you feel will best support liberty. But if that's all we do, we are truly getting the cart before the horse. Because if we get the right candidate elected, if they're true to their oath of office and adhere to the Constitution, if the public does not understand those principles, the media will have an easy time destroying them prior to their re-election. They'll serve one term and be done and make very little difference. If, on the other hand, we have a society that understands those principles, getting someone like that elected becomes very easy. So again, it's a good thing to be involved in, but we first must lay the foundation. This next line is one I'm quite fond of. Militant revolt, tax evasion, revolution. Let's all grab our guns, just march on Washington, kick the bums out. Now, that's a very bad idea. First of all, because even if we were to amass thousands of people ready to march on Washington with our arms, before you arrive, you would be met by the military, and they would put down your insurrection. In fact, interestingly, that's exactly what it says in Article 1, Section 8, that Congress has the duty to suppress insurrections. They'd be following the Constitution when they stopped us. But not only that, with all of these, whether it's tax evasion or revolution or whatever it is, none of those would ever work unless we first had educated enough people to understand the problems and be willing to take that level of extreme action. Because unless we have a major portion of society behind that movement, we're just an insurrection. And it'll be put out like a candle. No big deal. Now, wait a minute. The only way for these to work is if we first educate a major portion of society? Well, if we have educated a major portion of society, we've already won. We don't need our bullets at that point. We have a ballot. And we can win that way. So again, none of those really help us in any way. The one thing I want you to remember, any idea that's ever brought before you on here's how we can save the Constitution, restore liberty, always ask this question. Does it address the root of the problem? Does it create an informed electorate? If it doesn't do that, we will never restore liberty to an ignorant public. It can't be done. So, Thomas Jefferson, just to back up what I had to say, I have to call on one of my favorite founding fathers. He says, educate and inform the whole mass of the people. They are the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty. Couldn't say it better myself, so I'll let him say it. The solution is proper education. So how do we do that? How do we properly educate? Well, as I said before, we have to first educate ourselves. We can't lift someone to higher ground unless we're on that higher ground. Educate ourselves, and then we educate our community. Now, specifically, again, quoting from Sun Tzu, as I mentioned in the last lecture, he gave us this great advice that we need to know your enemies and know yourself. So these are the things that we need to be educating our public, our community on. We need to understand the principles of liberty and help others understand it as well. We need to understand the enemy and help others understand that as well. Now, to that end, the John Birch Society, more than any other group I've seen, does a massive amount of publishing of both books, magazines, articles, DVDs, and so on, educating on the principles of liberty. The New American, for example, I mentioned in the last lecture, and the power it had of turning someone around from being nearly socialist to being constitutionalist. We also have, on a weekly basis, Arthur Thompson, the CEO, gives us about a 10-minute review of the news, which is very insightful. I recommend just going to jbs.org on a regular basis and look up his latest videos. They're always right on the front page. And what he does is he goes into the national and international headlines and what's behind them that they're not telling you, what you ought to know about what's going on. I highly recommend that news source. A number of other things that we offer to help with that education process, besides the New American Magazine, our bookstore, Shop JBS. We have Liberty News Network, which from time to time does various interviews at major events and so on. Then under the American Opinion Foundation, we have Freedom Project, which puts out various constitutional brief lectures, brief studies, and so on, usually a video of about 5 or 10 minutes. Most of them right now are geared towards youth, and they're very enlightening. In addition to that, there's an online school called Freedom Project Education, in which the students can put on a headset and a microphone and talk directly with their instructors, and they have a blackboard, and they do instructions online and so on. And it's very much a classical education, very much after the vision of Thomas Jefferson and the way he was taught. Very different from the nearly Marxist agenda that's being taught in our public schools today. So for those that are interested in homeschooling but would like some help, this is a great tool for that. In addition to that, we publish a major amount of articles, videos, DVDs, magazines, books, booklets, understanding the enemy. Remember, that was the other part that we need to know thoroughly. And as I look around at other freedom groups and their publications, this is the area I find most of them are weakest in. Sometimes they have good amount of information on principles of liberty, but very few clearly explain the enemy. And of those that do, many of them end up in speculation, discrediting themselves in the process. It's vital that as we go into explaining the enemy, that we don't take one step into the speculation that would discredit you. So, how do we re-educate the public? The main theme here is we need to build influence. You want to do everything you can to build your influence. Staying away from the speculative theories helps with that. You don't want to lose influence. In every way, gradually building influence with those around us. I'll give you a few examples. We talked about in the last lecture the example of when I went around door to door handing out cards and just inviting people to read it and then let their state legislator know how they felt about it. I didn't tell them, you need to call and tell your senator to vote against this bill or vote for this bill or whatever. I let them decide. I just provided the information very passively. And virtually all of them called in saying, vote for this bill, we must have this marriage amendment. That process is a very good instruction that as we share information with those around us, which do you think would work better? If I came to you with an article and said, you really need to read this article because it will straighten you out. You are so confused on this topic, and this will set you straight. That might offend you. It did offend me. If, on the other hand, I came to you with an article and I said, Jack, I really appreciate your opinion. I'd love it if you would read through this article and let me know how you feel about it. I'd like to get your opinion on it, or something like that. How much more likely would you be to read an article where someone is asking for your opinion on it? Much more. It's a very passive approach. Unfortunately, I see that many times when people become aware of how far off track our nation has gone, they become fired up and full of enthusiasm. They want to grab their neighbor by the lapels and shake them and wake them up too. And that leads to frustration. They want to bang them over the head or whatever. And I've tried that, I admit it. I've tried to wake people up on my schedule. Frustrates them, frustrates me. If, on the other hand, we just share information with people on a passive basis, allowing them to come along at their own pace, some will love it, they'll embrace it, they'll want more. Others will seem pretty indifferent. That's okay. Just on a passive basis, share something with them from time to time. Eventually something may spark. Even the most committed liberal or socialist can be turned around with a passive sharing of information over time. In some cases, it might take a few years. That's okay. Let them come at their own schedule, not yours. That's one of the key factors in building influence. Now, the next thing I want to show is how to win elections. Congressman Larry McDonald, his history is very interesting. He first ran for U.S. Congress in 1972, but he lost. He ran as a Democrat, and he didn't do really any of the typical campaigning. You didn't see all the yard signs around and that type of thing. What he did instead was exactly what I'm doing. He went from community to community teaching the principles of the U.S. Constitution and then organizing teams in those communities to continue sharing that information while he's gone. He began an educational effort across his congressional district. Now, he ran again in 1974, and this time he won, because the people began to understand the principles of liberty. Then again, he was reelected in 76, 78, 80, and 82. And each time he gained a larger and larger margin. The reason being, the education continued. Each time they tried to take him out, running different people against him, he won even easier. When the people are educated on the principles of liberty and the Constitution, propaganda, media working against you, doesn't matter. Now, a few interesting details about him. He was a strict constitutionalist. Yes, even the Democrats can be strict constitutionalists, and he was one. He was one that always would look to the Constitution first before voting. Can I find in the Constitution the authority for this bill? No matter how much I like the bill, if it's not in there, I have to vote against it. That was his mantra. In addition to that, in 1983, he was appointed as the chairman of the John Birch Society, and of course received even more attacks because of that. But what he did to win elections is a very simple process. Educate, and then the people will easily elect you. That is how to get constitutionalists into office. Now, what we've discovered, Oklahoma in the last few years has started working the same process. And Oklahoma has transitioned from being a very, very liberal state. In their past history, they have never had a Republican majority in their state Senate, ever. And only between 1920 and 1921 did they have a Republican majority in their state House. Today, Oklahoma is looked at as one of the conservative leaders in our nation. They have a over 70% Republican majority in their House and Senate, and most of their U.S. congressmen, their governor, and so on. What happened? Education. Now, keep in mind, of course, just shifting from Democrat to Republican doesn't necessarily mean any change at all. I think we've amply covered that in previous lectures. But in this case, if you look at the type of legislation that's coming out of Oklahoma, they have definitely taken a strong stand for liberty and the Constitution. People today that know what Oklahoma is are surprised to learn what Oklahoma was. I went to Oklahoma a few years ago, met with some of these fine gentlemen who are some of the activist leaders that created this revolution, this turnaround. And what they taught me was very revealing. One of the things they taught me was what I call the power of 500. That in any congressional district in our country, when you can pull together a team of 500 to educate their communities, that's sufficient to restore constitutional understanding and turn that congressional district around. Whether your congressional district is one like Nancy Pelosi's, that one might take a few more years. But even there, they're not fools, they're just misinformed. And proper information can root out bad information in any district. 500. Now this is a DVD that recently came out by the John Birch Society explaining a little bit more of the details of how this power of 500 works. It's part of a 6-lecture DVD set for training new members of the John Birch Society on how to be effective activists. I highly recommend it. Of course, it's me on the video, so couldn't be that bad. But here's the key elements. In order to be part of this team of 500, you must be well trained. We need to understand the principles of liberty. We need to understand the enemy. And we need to understand what is effective action. How we can get information out into the hands of our friends and neighbors in a manner that is not offensive, in a manner that is influential. How we can build influence with key people in our community. And that effort must be coordinated in a very focused effort. When I say coordinated, I mean not just locally, but nationally. That last year, and this year as well, we're seeing national efforts to create support in every state legislature for calling for a constitutional convention or an amendments convention. In order to defeat that, as we've continued to do so year after year, it needs to be a coordinated effort around the entire nation. We've also defeated in years past an effort to nationalize our police force. Well, that effort is being revived again today because, again, they're trying to create a national police force so that our police are no longer answering to the communities they serve, they answer to the federal government. It doesn't take much of an imagination to see the dangers of that. The only way any of this is possible is if it's coordinated across the whole country. Battles that are across your whole state would need to be coordinated in your state. For that reason, the John Birch Society hires coordinators all across the country, state by state, congressional district by congressional district, to coordinate those efforts that need to be done on the local level or on the state level or on the national level. And then lastly, it must be done in a manner that can reach beyond the choir. The choir is those I refer to that do come out to educational events. When you host a class on the Constitution, the ones that show up are usually the same faces you see at any event. You recognize them. And if we only reach out to them, it's always a very small portion of society, and that's not enough to turn the next election, is it? But if we instead can reach outside the choir and start having an expanding influence into the community, that's where we start turning the minds back to the Constitution, and we start turning elections towards candidates that will support the Constitution. Those are the key elements that must be included. And again, in the Power of 500, we'll go into some more detail on that. Lastly, it's important to understand what we're against. We're fighting against an enemy that is well organized, very much like a well-seasoned army. Though they are few, they are very effective because they are so organized. On the other hand, within the freedom movement, we're very much like Lone Rangers. Because we love our independence so much, we tend to be very independent and not join. I hear it so often, I'm not a joiner. I don't care if you're not a joiner. Would it be worth joining if you could save your country? Because that's really what's at stake here. I'm willing to join if that's what it takes. If I need to join up with others and work in a coordinated fashion. Anyone that has any military experience understands the difference in power between a bunch of Lone Rangers and a well-organized military front. When it's orchestrated together, far more powerful. And we will never defeat the enemy running around independently. So, the Power of 500. The question I'm often asked is, can we really win? I'm sure that question was asked of George Washington in his day as well. And they, against very astonishing odds, did win. The only question I have is, will you take action? I know that we can win. The only question is, will enough people stand up, join together in a coordinated effort to restore liberty? If the answer to that is yes, then we will win. I have no doubt. And so with that, I invite you to help us build teams of 500. Build a team of 500 in your congressional district, because then we will win. You worry about your community and your congressional district. Let the others take care of themselves, because you can restore liberty in your district by helping build that team of 500. Thank you very much. May God bless America.